This is an overview of the approach we've taken to create the drill down behind each of the strategic objectives from the T&O strategy map. The idea is this: in this example strategy map from a different IT department, what we should be able to do is list those strategic objectives down the left side of a spreadsheet, and across the top take their core processes. In the case of T&O, we've used the ITIL framework to follow the BIA initiative and the view that they use of those processes. Now what we should be able to do is rank the impact and performance of each process as it supports each strategic objective. Let's take a closer look at that. Eventually, we'll end up being able to see both vertically how our process is performing inside of itself, and horizontally a new view which allows us to see how well we are able to execute that strategy based on the performance of the current processes. Let's take a look. So in the example of these strategic objectives down the left and this process called relationship management, we ask ourselves a question: what is the impact? And by impact, we're describing the processes impact on that strategic objective. So in the example of taking a look at the relationship management process impact on the objective enabled trusted collaboration, we're going to use a 1 to 5 scale, where 1 says the process has a minimal impact on that strategic objective, all the way up to 5, and that is the process is critical for that strategic objective success. In other words, if that process completely failed, we would not be able to achieve that strategic objective. In this example, the client gave it a score of 5. Secondly, we take a look at the performance. The performance is again 1 to 5 scale, where our guess is performing 1 would be very poorly in aid of that specific strategic objective, and 5 meeting expectations. Not exceeding, just meeting. The idea is that the contract you have with your customers is to meet their expectations. If you were to exceed it, that would be great, but chances are you're wasting T&O resources to deliver a quality level that's above and beyond what the customer's asked for or is willing to pay for. So our job is to meet expectations. If you want to set that bar higher, then set that in agreement with your customer, and that becomes a new 5. In this case, they've given it a score of 2 out of 5. In other words, there's a significant performance gap. In fact, mathematically, the spreadsheet would color that as red. The gap in performance is significant. Now, the gap is calculated by taking the weighting times the impact times the gap. In this case, it would be a value of 3 between the performance score and the desired performance, which of course is always meet expectations. Now, for this initial analysis, we're more concerned about where that impact occurs. Later on, everywhere there's a 5, we'll be developing a drill down dashboard to give us the real performance data as it relates to where this red square is. But for now, if we take a look at the overall performance, we begin to see a mix of where processes are meeting expectations, slightly below, or significantly below. If we put that back into the overall chart, what you'll see is in some cases we'll have the same score, an impact of 5 and a performance of 3, but in some cases it's green, and that's because the weighting of that objective is lower. It's only 5, and therefore a lower performance level is acceptable. In other cases, with a weighting of 10 in this example, it's yellow. A performance of 3 causes caution, but we should be able to solve that performance issue inside of our regular meetings. In the case where the performance of 3 gets us a red, where there's a weighting of 15, the suggestion is you probably need to take some heroic efforts to address that performance issue. You know, a specialized team, a focus group, and so forth. The net is we can also add this score up horizontally to give this kind of visibility. What we're seeing here is the height of this bar represents the amount of process support that this strategic objective requires. The blue portion represents how well we're currently performing, and the gold is a gap between our current performance level and what the strategy calls for. Now, what you're seeing here is typical with most organizations, and that is this. There's a significant difference between, the largest gap and the smallest gap. And although the guesstimate about impact and the guesstimate about performance are just that, when you see this size of difference between the gold bars, we actually don't need to be that much more precise than what we are. Now, several clients have asked us to do a more detailed analysis, and we've done so, and the results are typically within 10% of what we get through this cross-functional team checking each other and coming up with a score. And if we just take a look at the gaps themselves, again, there's a significant distribution, and it's easy to focus the leadership team on the right issues. How do we focus on it? Well, we go and launch projects to close those performance gaps. And, once you take a look at each of those projects, we can then rate how much those projects are going to cost us in terms of resource consumption and where they have the biggest impact. Once again, we can add that up and score those. In this case, we represent them as red dots. In other words, there's a lot of projects associated with objective C1, have reliable experiences, and not many projects with right things first. So the height of the dot represents the amount of project focus across the portfolio of the release projects. When we combine those two charts, the gaps and the projects, we see something like this. So in some cases, we have a good match between the gap and the investment. In other cases, we may be underinvesting. In fact, typically in an organization in their first year or two, we see a huge dispersion between the gold bars and the red dots. And it takes the organization several years before it becomes aligned like you're seeing here. So we're doing two things through this project. We're giving visibility to where the linkages are between processes and strategic objectives, and where projects support those strategic objectives. And it's that spreadsheet that's going to allow us to identify where to build the drill down dashboards. And the charts you're looking at here are interesting for management to begin to make sure that our strategy is aligned. We'll be using these sorts of reports later in some of the driver-based planning and productivity work. But for now, the key activity is finding out where the drill downs are on the dashboard. So again, if we wanted to understand the objective of right things first, we understand that we should have a measure around relationship, around IT strategy management. We don't need an indicator for ITS business management because there's no relationship, and so on. So we can logically understand where the drill down is, both in terms of the processes and the projects.